thinking about it, and I know I shared a paper that I think you'd shared already anyway, but it was looking at what nutritional intake you could have for different tissues and particularly for different types of injuries. So I think if we go through that, it might be useful for listeners to kind of get a bit of an idea of what kind of things might be supportive for different injury types, but also different tissues. You mentioned bone before, and I think it's really clear that there's a few things that contribute to that sort of process. And I know that you've spoken about people like Stuart Warden before. He's got some really good research on some of these areas, but it's really clear that there are certain characteristics that really optimize things like bone density. Now, the unfortunate thing is that typically most of that is done earlier in life. So if you haven't started doing it, or you haven't had exposure to those, whether it be nutrients or also those factors in relation to mechanical loading, you sometimes don't get the benefits later in life. You still maintain some mechanical sensitivity, but you may not ever have the bone density of someone who has been doing it for a much longer period and through the sensitive years of that development.
And that probably then relates to understanding that when we think about bone strength, we can think of quantity, quality, and organisation.
Yes.
So quantity might be more compromised because you won't build up as much density, so to speak, but certainly we can see changes in the quality or organisation of it as we apply mechanical loads.
Yeah. So if we like, and I guess you're much more knowledgeable on this stuff than me, so I might even ask you questions. But say for bone, what are the key factors that seem to be supportive of bone tissue and healthy, high quality bone tissue, as you said? I think we preface this by saying that there is evidence, and you can read some of this stuff. As I mentioned, Stuart Warden's probably the person that you want to go and chase down, who has suggested that you want to get, particularly for females, you want to get this stuff laid down in your development years as a teen. So those are the key things. I'm actually going to go turn that off, Joe.
Yeah, sure.
Give us
a brief interim. Well, look, there's clearly certain nutrients that have been very well established as being very important for bone metabolism, and these are the ones that most people have heard of when we think about vitamin D, calcium, and protein consumption. I think the thing that we need to consider too is, again, any metabolism of any tissue doesn't happen in a vacuum, and typically even if you look at the actual biochemistry, there's actually a lot of cofactors involved. So for instance, we know that, say, magnesium is really relevant for essentially as a gate for allowing calcium to enter bone. Another really important one that often gets overlooked or forgotten about is vitamin K2.
Yeah. And where do you, like, I know you've mentioned this a lot. What are some of the sources of vitamin K2 that you can readily get?
Well, the big thing to understand is people have heard of typically vitamin K, but you need to differentiate K1 and K2 because they have very different roles in human physiology. Because K1 you can get a lot from basically like green leafy vegetables, but it doesn't have the ability doesn't play the role of K2, and it can't be converted to K2. So K2 is really important for calcium metabolism, ensuring that it provides, or calcium gets into hard tissue like bone. In addition, it's actually really important for hormonal health. But K2 typically is from animal products, so you'll see it in eggs, you'll see it in a lot of fermented dairy, like a lot of cheeses. You do get it in organ meats too. Liver, I know, is one. And then it's an area that still needs more work and knowledge, but like a lot of meat will get it. I know pork, I think in particular, does, and I think darker cuts of chicken, like chicken thighs.
Yeah.
There's some really interesting stuff that Chris Masterjohn has. He actually has a K2 database and calculator that you can look at, and he talks a lot about K2, so he's certainly a really useful resource to look at for understanding where you get K2 from.